what's your opinion on the digital divide? And if that's the case, if you support it, the notion of it, or not support the notion of it, how often do you try to incorporate media aspects and digital products into your teaching?
I mean, first of all, I think the digital divide does exist and it's unfortunate. But what I see more is I think students have access to the internet, but it's having access to the appropriate programs and knowing how to use them. Microsoft Word, they can have internet on their phone, they can respond to Facebook messages, but sitting down on a PC and typing a paper, do they have adequate resources, to printers, to other things? In our school, we have to have the school open, and after 3:30, if they don't have a computer, they'll work on it in the computer lab. So,
yeah, I have students who still double space by pressing enter at the end of the line. And I've taught them like multiple times because they just don't practice it. It's not a skill that's been taught to them, and these are like my strongest students. But the idea that if there's no access to computers, how can we expect our students, we do expect it, but it's an unfair disadvantage that my students are at in terms of going to college and being able to be successful.
I see it, it definitely does exist, and I see in where I work, where you have kids who have, every room has a computer, they have an iPad, they have, an iTouch and things like this, and then you have the kids sitting next to them that they don't have their own computer and they don't have access to it at home. But I will say our district has been doing a really good job from the elementary schools, so by the time they come to us at middle or high school, they know how to use a lot of these programs. They know how to use a Mac, they know how to use a PC and things like that, and they can figure their way around it. However, a lot of them, I won't say a lot, but there are quite a bit now that still do not have the access at home to do it on a regular basis.
for example, our school requires Castle Learning, which is a program that has online access, and I chose not to assign homework on Castle Learning for that very reason of the digital divide. It's on there for extra practice, but not mandatory homework. I mean, the question is, how do we provide that access to students all the time? Obviously, we say the internet's a great way to learn, but we're still in the process of getting access, and I teach in the South Bronx, the nation's poorest congressional district, so it's especially pronounced there.
I think access issues are, I taught in a rural area, and there was a major issues with kids not having computers at home, and the computers that they had even at the school, because the schools can be under-resourced as well. They were very old, and usually it took about half a period to boot up. So I think that there are so many social justice issues in there, but dealing within those resources and trying to figure out the best way to have representations for the students and the best way to work within those resources is really the only way that you can operate as a teacher.
And my question as a social studies teacher, is it my job to provide the training with those digital resources? We don't do that. Should we be spending our time showing them how to use these resources when we have state exams and we have other pressures to be in a very long and diverse curriculum?
Do you guys support that, what Patrick just said? The idea that it's not necessarily our job as social studies teachers to teach them media literacy or things like that?
It's been shifted into our role, and I think that as a high school teacher, I would hope that I could just assume that knowledge, but it's a role that, because my students need it, I feel like it's my job to do it. Like it's just because the need is so high that I
definitely see a rift, especially in my school right now. We're in the process of re-imaging, and technologies we're STEM schools, so technology plays a big role. And there's the question of whether the students should be taken out of their technology class, or should technology be incorporated within the class more. And that's a big issue that we're seeing now. And I can see if they're taking out of technology, some of those skills are not going to be focused on as much if they're just incorporating it within more. Because realistically, even though we have all this technology, can we really incorporate it as much as we need to? They need the skills to do it as well.
I think there's also different types of media literacy. There's sort of critical media literacy, sort of what the first question you asked us. I think that's absolutely part of social studies.
Yes.
But I mean, in terms of teaching them how to double space.
How to use PowerPoint.
Or use PowerPoint.
Not really.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think that, you know.
Trickles down to us.
Yeah, it trickles down to us. That's, you know, out of our hands, I guess, in a lot of ways.
I think there's something to be said for them learning technology by having to use it on some level. I mean, if for instance, if they're just taught right out how to double space it, are they going to remember it as much as if they have to double space it in order to write a paper for us?
Yeah, but should I be spending my time, you know, my very limited amount of time teaching them, like, oh, this is how you start a new slide on PowerPoint? You know, like, that's the kind of the stuff that should be taught in other things, but because it's not taught, it trickles down into our job as well. My concern is that I feel like I should be focusing on issues that are more relevant to the study of social studies in terms of like how to be critical, like to spend more time on writing, like, or on what to write on a PowerPoint slide as opposed to
Right, the
how to do
content
it.
is about the process of actually
Yeah,
making it.
but the critical media literacy, I agree, is very much in our purview and should be.
But do you think it would be better if they took 5 minutes off of your class and made a technology class?
For my students, yes. I think that my students would benefit from something that was explicitly to teach them the skills of
That's a
using
21st
Microsoft
century
Office.
skill that they will need to be
Like
successful.
Microsoft
Absolutely.
Office, I had a Microsoft Office class when I was in 8th grade, and it's a
Mm-hmm.
skill of learning to use Excel, learning to use Word. That's a skill that, like, I think you just need in society today.
See, I just think learning within the context of having to use it, there's something to be
But
said
like
for that.
then that should happen in middle school, or I don't know. I just think that there is, like, I took an explicit class, and then in my other classes I also had to use it, and they were also reviewed. But it was something where I actually had a class that taught me how to.
I think that may go along with the culture of your school and what's the curriculum, what's the curriculum in your school? Are they implemented, do the students have the opportunity to take a class where they
Yeah,
can
we
learn
don't have a
about,
computer lab.
you know, Microsoft Office and using all these programs, as opposed to you getting a laptop card or going into a lab and say, okay, now we have to use PowerPoint, but yet they've never been experienced to it. When you as a teacher, a social studies teacher, you're like Elizabeth was saying, her focus really isn't on the actual process of creating the slideshow, but what's
The product, yeah.
the product is.
All right, very cool. Any other comments about media and the social studies?
Absolutely not.
All right, cool. Thank you guys very much, and have an awesome break.